Hello to a special episode of Dezarticast, again with my Iliescu English. Today we have a special guest, Sebastian, who's a Romanian expat living in the US.
Hello.
So, Sebastian, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I am, Romanian. Obviously, my family migrated here when I was like 1.5. I don't know how in depth I should go about this, but so pretty much how it worked was my dad, he fled Romania in, I think, 87.
Oh.
So he ran the border with a couple other guys. One of them was my uncle. And so they fled into Hungary. And then from there, they were imprisoned for a little bit for crossing the border. But they had, I don't know if you know about that whole thing where if at the time, if you were to flee like a communist country, you had like where the other, like the US was accepting refugees, I guess, from fleeing communist countries, right? Like
political asylum.
Yes, exactly. So from there, they were able to come to the US pretty easily from that point. And so once they got here, then they were able to just have the rest of us fly over there. So it was me. I have a brother and 3 sisters. And so that's kind of like how I got to the U.S. And that was, I got to the U.S. in 88. So a year before the
revolution.
Exactly. Yeah. So I grew up in like a Romanian community in the U.S. So like there's pockets of those everywhere. There's, they're typically very religious, right? So like I grew up in, Portland, Oregon. And so like there's a very big Romanian community there. It's like Pentecostal. And so I kind of grew up in that. That's like my exposure to like Romanian politics and Romania. My Romanian experience is very Americanized in a way. It's very like, it was always given to me through the filter of these Romanians that are in America, right? That like fled the Romania. So.
Okay. I think this might answer a question I wanted to ask you, which is most Romanian expats, most Romanians that left the country, especially during that time, are not left. They are. Most of them are pretty apolitical. Some of them turn very right wing. Some of them turn. Even if they have the emotional and intellectual inclination to become more progressive, more egalitarian, they cannot become leftist, so they become a sort of ultra-liberal people. The kinds of I'm with her people that after 2 years they're still with her,
Right, yeah.
I don't think there are very many of them, but from those I know, these are the categories. And yeah, I think because many of them left either in their adolescence or after they've already lived through communism, and they left at 20-30 years after they made they went to school in the 90s. In the 90s, when they were very liberally formed, like the World Bank hold seminars at our universities because all our professors and all our academicians were communists. So we had to import the knowledge base, and we imported the most hegemonic vision of the world at the time, the Washington Consensus.
Re-education, right?
Yeah. I mean, basically Eastern Europe and South America were the laboratory for neoliberalism. And yeah, when people were living Romania, all they knew about Romania and about communism was that very harsh period of the 80s. And when they were arriving in the Western countries, they were experiencing a sort of welfare state, but a very depoliticized welfare state. So they couldn't experience the states themselves wouldn't acknowledge the struggles, the workplace struggles, the union struggles that took place to produce that welfare.
Yeah.
So they arrived at a very depoliticized welfare state that was starting to crumble, of course, in the 90s, but it was still there in most of the Western world, and they experienced it as it wanted itself to be experienced, like the result of a technocratic, apolitical process So Western liberalism works because of the rule of law and the free markets, and this is the prosperity that these principles give to us. So yeah, this is why I think most people tend to internalize that worldview very strongly.
Yeah.
And if you say that you immigrated when you're very young, yeah, I think that at least in part is one of the reason you became a lefty. But or I don't know if that's the reason. That's the reason why you didn't end up. You had the opportunity to become a lefty. I don't know. You should tell us how you ended up.
Yeah, I mean, it's always kind of interesting because it's hard to say like what the exact conditions were that lead someone to be like more receptive to some ideologies and not others. But like I will say, so like I was not super political for the vast majority of my life, and I'd say I'm a pretty fresh lefty in the sense that probably my mid-20s was when I actually first started to understand even like what the leftist political project was. Because before that, like pretty much everything that you would know, like if you're brought up in a conservative community, everything you know about the left is almost just like, I don't know how to say it, like it's a caricature, right? Like it's what they think they want, right? Like there's never an actual attempt to understand what the left's project is and why it's bad, right? Because like they believe it's bad, they believe the left is wrong and all this stuff, but like there's never really a analysis that explains why it's bad or like, you know, what is it that they're trying to do and, you know, why should we oppose it? Yeah, so the majority of it's just been like, you know, it's funny because I'll say like I was not political, but I very much had political opinions that were just like adopted from like my parents or my community, right? But it wasn't political in the sense that like I gave it much thought or took much time to develop those opinions. It just kind of like you just mirror kind of like the environment you're in. But yeah, it was kind of like in my mid-20s when I ended up, I think I don't even remember how, but I got introduced to, if you're familiar with Howard Zinn, and he wrote a book on, it's called The People's History of the United States. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've read that, and then it kind of like blew me away because it kind of gave a perspective of history that I never knew. Like, for example, I never even had an understanding of what socialism was, like the actual meaning and what it entailed. It was always just kind of like I don't know, like with my Romanian parents, right? Like I'll ask them like, what was communism like? You know, what was that like? And they'll just say like, yeah, it's just like an authoritarian government. Like they just tell you like you have no freedom. Like that's the extent of what I knew about it. Was just like these very kind of general things of it's when the government does things without the population's input, you know, like it's undemocratic, like that's the idea. But then like you read labor history and you read kind of like the actual socialist movements that were behind trying to make things more democratic and make the workplace more democratic. And then it's like, wait, that's the left, you know, like that's what they're trying to do. Like, and like for a while, it didn't make sense to me because it's like, why am I only now hearing about this? You know, because it's not taught in schools or it's never addressed in any meaningful way by the right or by conservatives, you know.
It's not addressed by liberals.
Yeah, or by liberals. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, they're on the right as well, but they have no incentive to do it because they acknowledging that the workday arrived through union struggles, through protests, through the Haymarket massacre.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's the way we arrived at this. At this thing that the working class benefits from, and not through technocratic legislative efforts that would undermine their ideology and their political efforts.
Yeah, I mean, if you were to just take their word for it, you would, or like just have their interpretation of history, you would think like these benefits just came out of nowhere, like they just spontaneously, you know, like bosses just decided to be benevolent to workers out of nowhere. Like that's what you would think because, you know, you never hear the struggle that got them to that point, you know?
Or even worse, they'd say that that was the rational thing to do, and then the bosses recognize the rational thing to do. That's a mystification that happens a lot with Ford, for example.
Oh yeah.
From what I've seen, because in the liberal circles, Ford is recognized as being the first one to give the workers a shortened workday and to give benefits and better wages, because that was a rational thing to do in the market. But actually, if you look into what he actually did, he traded in some benefits for a lot of control into the life of the workers. Like some of the wages he increased were conditioned by the worker living a hygienic lifestyle.
Yeah.
And stuff like this. So they tell you that the free market ideology is what pushes bosses to employ these measures that are the rational thing to do in the workplace, when the historical reality is not that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, who was it? I can't remember if it was like, it was either Marx or Antonio Gramsci, where they talked about like cultural hegemony, and they talked about like that people typically will adopt the ideology of the ruling class, right? So it's very hard to get sort of like a perspective of history that doesn't just directly contradict the story you're getting from, you know, these very powerful institutions. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's why for a lot of time, I think the left, at least in the Western world, because as you said, you didn't know what socialism is. I think until 2016, until Bernie Sanders, what we thought socialism was, at least according to the discourse on Western platforms, is basically socialism is when the government does stuff.
Yeah.
When the government provides healthcare, when the government provides social services and so on. That's socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you read the People's History of Howard Zinn.
Yeah, and that was my introduction to like labor history. And then from there, I really got into Noam Chomsky, and I think those two, like Howard Zinn and Noam Chomsky, were like extremely influential to me in terms of understanding the left, understanding socialism, anarchism, and I think one of my favorite books by Chomsky was On Anarchism, and that is just, I mean, it's a really short book, but like he kind of just goes through just the overlying principles. He gives some examples like in history, like. He talks, I think there's a chapter in there about Catalonia and their civil war. But yeah, I mean, from there, it was just kind of like a floodgate was open, because there's so many places you can go from there, right? Like Pierre Proudhon, Kropotkin, Rousseau. I read a little Orwell, you know, like, so all of it was very kind of like I had to have time myself to do it. Like, you know, it's not like I was involved in groups that were like, at the time, at least, where they're giving you like these reading materials or whatever. So like, yeah, it was just mainly recommendations from like, or references that Noam Chomsky would make in his book. And then I'm like, oh, who's this author? And then I'll look him up or something. It's interesting because I feel like you'll talk about liberals more, because I feel like that's more like your opposition is going to be like liberals who I guess like are I don't know how to say it, like maybe that's more your interaction in politics is going to be with liberals, where it's like I don't know much about liberals until I got into like DSA or like, you know what I mean, like because most of my understanding of liberals was, again, like they just get lumped up with the left and the left is bad. And like, I was just brought up in that, like that conservative circle where that's, you know, my main understanding of politics growing up was from that perspective. And I had no idea even like what the distinction between a liberal or a leftist was, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah. That makes sense.
But I mean, I feel like I understand it better now. But yeah, it's interesting because like in, you know, DSA in Portland, which is like I'm more involved in their branch, is that you know, their main opposition is liberals. You know, like political liberals in Portland tend to, you know, in terms of like what the left wants, is extremely conservative. You know, they do a lot of neoliberal policy. They do a lot of, you know, tax cuts for the rich. They do a lot of that kind of stuff, and austerity.
Yeah. So how did you get involved with DSA?
Yeah, so I got involved in DSA after Trump got elected. I think what it was is, like I kind of had that foundation from understanding, reading Noam Chomsky and all these other people of what the left is and what the project is. And, so at that point, I considered myself, a leftist, or more specifically, like an anarchist, just in terms of like accepting, like, I think that's the ideology that I align with the most. But then once, like, I feel like Trump got elected, then it's like, okay, I have these beliefs, but I'm not really doing anything about it. I'm not really acting on them. And if I really do think that these things are like worth pursuing and that the world does need to be changed within these directions, that, I got to find something to do. I got to get like, and that's kind of like when I got in, I think, honestly, I think DSA was just like one of the first things that came up when I did like a Google search. So, and a part of that, I think, like once I got into DSA, I found out that like they actually got a huge surge in membership after Trump got elected. And part of it was because of Bernie Sanders' popularization of the term of democratic socialism. And so a lot of people would like, what is that? And they'll Google it. And DSA is like one of the first things that comes up.
Yeah, I think globally, Bernie Sanders, and to somewhat a lesser extent, Jeremy Corbyn, even though he's much more radical, the hegemony that the UK has is lesser than that the US has over the world. Mm-hmm. I think spurred a wave of re-education and reappropriation of socialist thought.
So, they got a really big boost in membership there. But yeah, DSA is, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they're more of like an open tent organization. And the work that they do is primarily driven by each individual branch. The Portland branch of DSA is going to be, probably a lot more radical than what they decide to work on is going to be different than maybe a branch in California or one in Texas or something. From there, I think the biggest benefit that I got from starting in work with DSA is the fact that I felt like I got more of a holistic education in like Marxism and the left, because there is a lot of really smart people in DSA, and they're always eager to do like reading groups and these small like community education stuff. So I felt like that was extremely beneficial to me personally. And then they also do a lot more work. They've been helping to organize the Burgerville workers and other fast food workers. Like we have a restaurant like Little Big Burger. So they've been trying to unionize there. So like, and then joining when we had the teacher strikes, a lot of DSA members went to support the teachers there. So that's, that kind of stuff.
In regards to electoral politics, does your branch take part into that, or kind of shuns it?
They do. I feel like there's just from my experience in DSA, there is this kind of people that are more soc dems, and then there's a group of people that are more, I guess, revolutionary. And I feel like the more revolutionary side is a lot more geared towards organizing like unions and organizing workers, whereas like the soc dems are more interested in like electoral politics. My personal opinion is that like you kind of just got to do both, right? Like I think electoral politics is like necessary but not sufficient.
Of course.
So I guess it's kind of cool because like if there's enough people that are interested in doing work in anything in DSA, that they can just create a working group and do work for it. Like it's very organic in terms of how people organize there. It's not very top driven, which is kind of cool. There is, things we vote on and do things kind of like as a larger organization, but the majority of the work that's done is done through working groups. And they're very like more like small groups of people who like are organizing for a specific cause. Like I think a couple months ago, we did canvassing for Medicare for All. You know what I mean? So, and that was just organized through a Medicare for All working group. And they're just like, okay, let's start knocking on doors and getting people aware of, how important it is to get universal healthcare, Yeah. So that's just an example. But, there's people who, and I don't know, like it, I guess if you think of, like universal healthcare, that's a very specific policy position, but there's very real electoral routes you can go about that. You know, like there is this sort of education process of getting people aware about what it is and why it's important. But then there's also, we got to get people elected who are going to push those things through as well.
Yeah, and actually push it, not just call it Medicare for all, but basically just do Affordable Care Act too.
Right.
Like almost all the Democratic candidates are trying to do right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because you can see the sort of pressure that they have to sort of address healthcare. And a lot of them will sort of mimic the wording of Bernie Sanders, right? Like they'll copy him a little bit, but they'll always have this caveat. They'll always be like, oh, well, you know, we got to make sure we save these insurance jobs because having those jobs is important. You know what I mean? Like, or
offering the people the opportunity to choose.
Yeah,
that's a big talking point, and it's a talking point that arrived even here.
Oh,
which is I don't know how it happened because we don't really have private insurance in Romania. So if even the private hospitals and private clinics that offer packages for analysis and some operations, so for one thing that they still get money from the national insurance, for one thing, and the other, their major operations are done in state hospitals already. So private insurance is not a thing in Romania, especially not to the degree that's in the US, and especially people don't really care to choose so much. Yeah. And the only reason this talking point arrived here is because you are so fucking big. You are so fucking big and powerful, and, and your positions affect the whole world, and especially the smaller states, like more influential states.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even here, so like that talking point alone, right? I forgot which book. I think it might have been Manufacturing Consent, where Noam Chomsky talks about like how media is. He talks about with Edmund Herman the propaganda model, and he mentions how like the U.S. population is extremely polled. Like institutions know the sentiments that the American population has. Like they know like what they prefer, what the, you know, like, you know, there's no confusion that, like, for example, universal healthcare is extremely popular. So they will actually brand test certain marketing ways of framing an issue that benefits them, but it sounds like it benefits the population, right? Like it's very, very manipulative, I guess is how I would say it. Because they know Medicare's, or like, you know, when they poll, you know, what sort of health services are most popular in the US, it's always Medicare and like the one given, I forgot what it's called, to the military, the VA. Like those are the most popular health service providers in the US, and they like completely outnumber like people hate private insurance. People like just typically don't like it. But you know, they know that, so they'll frame the message that then that's where the sort of like, oh, well, what if we framed it in the way of like government run healthcare? Like we won't say, you know, like publicly funded or whatever. Like we'll just say, you know, government taking control of your healthcare, or we'll say less freedom healthcare, or you know what I mean? Like that's just an example, but like they'll try to word it in a way to like really just get support for things that are like contrary to what someone would actually want if they had like a proper understanding of these issues, you know. And I don't know, I feel like in the US, there's this big profit incentive to keep people as stupid and ignorant as possible because they're so much easier to manipulate if they don't know things. It's interesting to hear from you how like that sort of messaging gets exported to like different countries. That's something I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, there are lots of attitudes and projects that get exported from the US into Romania. Maybe I'll get into it a bit later. I was going to ask you about still about DSA. You said that you vote on stuff. I know that you had a convention recently. What did you decide there, and what do you think about the process?
I mean, I feel kind of bad because like I personally am not very interested in national DSA, like the stuff that and that's primarily what the convention was about, is like the national DSA and what they do with their funds and what sort of things they support or not support, and I'm just not very plugged into that side of it. I know we sent delegates there on our behalf, but I'm really just more interested in kind of like the local things and the local activism that DSA does. But yeah, it would be hard to say specifically like what they voted on for me without just like Googling it and looking it up. So
no, it's that's still nice. It's nice that you can still do your work and participate without having to be really plugged into the national side of the politics.
I mean, there did come out a lot of commentary on the convention, and I did like, I think I watched one video like where it was just I think it was just a 1 hour part of the conference, and just like I did the mistake of reading the comment section, and it was just very hard to read. The type of things that people focus on is just so bizarre.
Yeah, so there are lots of articles and videos made mostly by right-wing press that somehow got circulated into left-wing Romanian groups, because not everyone starts to search about the history of some publication or some site or some YouTuber, and people are interested in left and stuff that touches on left-wing politics, and they are looking at various news and whatever comes up into their search results or into their feed. And so they come across all these posts made by right-wing people that don't really advertise themselves to be right-wing people. So they claim to be centrists or whatever. So yeah, a lot of these kinds of posts ended up on left-wing groups, Romanian left-wing groups, and kind of fuel the sentiment that many of these people have, that the left in the West lost its not only its revolutionary purpose and focus, but also its focus on the working class issues. And they get mired into identity politics and into these kinds of academic issues, and they focus so much on language instead of focusing on talking to the common people, which is kind of, I don't know, it's a pretty bullshit
right
on my part, but what's your perspective on this?
I mean, it's weird. It's weird for me to understand why it's such a big deal to people. It seems like just to give you an example, like when I first started attending like DSA meetings, and I noticed like people were just, you know, like when they introduce themselves, they'll say what their preferred pronoun is sometimes. And it caught me off guard for a second. It's like, oh, that's like, I've never seen that before. Like, and I didn't know much about like trans issues, for example. And that is probably a product of kind of like, you know, my environment. But I don't know, like the last thing I would have thought of is like, oh man, like this is unworkable. Like I can't work with these people because look, they're recognizing that people have preferred pronouns. You know what I mean? Like it just seems so weird to me that can become such a big issue for some people, or like I just don't get it. I can't relate to that at all. So it's kind of disheartening a little bit. Like it's kind of like, you know, why would this stop you from wanting to pursue a left project just because, you know, I just don't get it. I mean, I guess my question for you would be like, is that sentiment like an American thing, or are people in Europe kind of like not so much focused on that side of politics, or is this another thing that's getting exported from the US?
I think there are two dimensions to this. One is a more academic, because so a lot of cultural studies and a lot of this academic issue that developed into the so-called identity politics side of things came from French theory. So 60s postmodernists, post-structuralists, that got translated into English and developed in American universities. They went on with Judy Butler and so on. The French theorists that are coming from that original tradition kind of think that the Americans bastardized it a bit. There is a French author, I think, that's very influential in the American side, and she kind of reneges what the Americans did with it. She insists that what they took as political for her was more poetic and about self-expression and stuff like that. So that's one side of it. Kind of related to it, it's the 68 moment in Europe. Basically, our hippie moment. I think it's much more influential for the European left. The 68 moment was all sorts of revolts all over Europe, and that not only that failed but resulted in a major right-wing electoral success. So in French, for example, the French protests, the students, the situationists on the streets, their slogans, that's the story how it goes. The students revolted with the new left, with their post-structuralist theory, the rejection of materialism. They tried to create a new kind of politics. They didn't know what to do with it. The moment the energy dissolved, the political structures that were left were destroyed by Charles de Gaulle, giving his party one of the most powerful parliamentary electoral victories in their party's history, and so on. So a lot of the stronger left, so the left that didn't grow to be this modern social democratic left, kind of blamed a lot of their further and present lack of success to that moment, that rejection of Marxism-Leninism, of the USSR, of strong working class struggles, which is a major subject. We're preparing an episode on that.
Yeah.
Because it's a very interesting subject. And that's on one side of it. Another side of it, it's a very big American export because there is a very strong arm of right-wing propaganda that pushes content constantly in so many forms, even in reputable newspapers.
Yeah,
like there are people in the Atlantic or in New York Times that are railing against students. For a while there was a panic among Romanian professors, university professors, about safe spaces and trigger warnings, because Telegraph kept posting articles about... This is very strange, because the Telegraph, a British newspaper, was constantly publishing articles about students from the US.
Yeah.
And this was a very strong right-wing project, because there are some organizations in the US, some campus organizations that's all they do. They search out for fiery leftist students or professors. They frame some of their positions in very inflammatory language. They send them to various newspapers, and those newspapers make it out to be even worse than it is, and it's usually not that big of a deal. And so Romanian people are reading about it, and they think that the Americans want to take out Shakespeare from the curriculum because he's a white man.
Yeah. This is okay. Let me ask you this, because this is something I've noticed, and I'm almost lost at understanding, like I don't know how to address it, but it's that the right is absolutely never a good faith actor in terms of like engaging left ideas in an honest way, like they'll never portray a position on the left that's not just completely hyperbolic or made up or a straw man, or do you know what I mean? Like, and I don't know how to respond to that a lot of the time, because it's just like how you brought up, like these type of groups are very well funded, and they're just like constantly pumping out content, and for you to try to like give a response, like there's like the left doesn't have that type of reach. or doesn't have that type of funding to like engage with this sort of propaganda that's being pumped out of the right. Do you see what I'm saying, or what do you think about that?
That's a situation. It's a very strong asymmetry of power.
Consider, for example, are you familiar with Steven Crowder and Ben Shapiro?
Yeah.
Okay, so they will only debate or argue with, they'll find the most ridiculous freshman year college students on campus and pose to them some sort of, you know what I mean? It's not even an attempt to sort of be you think workers organizing for, that, you think that's a good thing? Well, here are the reasons why that's bad. It's never, they're you want a safe space? Do you hate new ideas, or do you want to censor anybody who disagrees with you? You know what I mean? It's frustrating, honestly. And I feel like it's almost intensified just since, Trumpism has come about, and we're kind of in this new political sphere where it's, the things that used to be more implied are just said explicitly now. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it does. I think to a degree that's good that there isn't the cards are more on the table now.
Yeah,
but I still think that in this regard the liberals play a big part of the guilt for this, because the marketplace of ideas, that's a liberal conception, that's a liberal idea, not a conservative one. The conservatives are using it, and as you said, they are using it in a bad faith way, and the liberals don't acknowledge it, because were they to acknowledge that bad faith actors are on the table and are shifting the rules of the game by pumping money into immense amounts of money into it, they would have to acknowledge that the system is bad, and acknowledging the system is bad, they'd have to become socialists. and most of them don't really want to do that.
No, I think you bring up a good point. That's true.
So regarding the apprehension towards, I don't really, more socially and identitarian targeted concerns and demands. I think from what I've seen in the US, a lot of the most powerful recent workers movements were targeted precisely among identitarian lines, implicitly or explicitly. So, for example, one of the largest protest movements recently, I think it was the teachers' protests.
Yep.
And because we live in a patriarchal society, a lot of the teachers were women, and their concerns were there was a very strong intersection between workers' rights and women's rights there. So I think this is something that these people, the left people, miss when they talk about these subjects, as well as the Google walkout, which was, I think, at least in part a reaction to, in the context of the James Damore memo and so on.
Oh, yeah. Just a quick sidebar. It's so interesting to me how easy it is to get into the right-wing circuits of appearing on every single right-wing talk show multiple times, is just to get fired for publishing a pretty sexist memo in your work. That's I mean, I think that says a lot about the sort of manufactured outrage culture that exists within the right. They love those stories, and they are gonna beat it like a dead horse. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and they keep shouting about how they are silenced, and their ideas are shunned. And
well, I think and I don't know how you'll have to tell me how this is in Europe, but anytime the right has to defend an idea that's just, it's so wrong, it's so obviously wrong, that anytime that's the case, they always will just frame it within the premise of free speech, that they'll never actually talk about what it is that actually got that person fired, or why that person is should be shunned. But it's always oh, now we're super concerned about free speech. That's a lot of our the right wing rallies that are proto-fascist in the US are usually called something in regards to like free speech, something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I don't know. Europe is a lot more fragmented than US.
Right.
So in Romania we don't really have these kinds of issues because the people who would protest stuff like that don't really have a voice.
Oh, what do you mean, like fascist groups or?
No. I mean the progressives.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah.
They don't really have... So a few years ago, one of the most prominent Romanian intellectuals basically said that the feminist made it so that he cannot find underwear with a pocket for his penis. And he wrote that in a column in a major intellectual magazine.
Oh,
and
man.
It was fine. But again, and a Romanian poet, very admired poet, a woman poet, a few years ago again said something about the Muslim hordes coming at our doors.
Yeah.
During a speech she held at the university, and again, nothing happened. Basically, in Romania, you can be pretty sexist and racist and whatever. They can't do it. The one thing that that happened recently, and this shows the intersections between race and class and gender, was that a music performer was fined by CNA, the censors, the TV censors, was fined because one of his video clips had violence towards women. So he was fined about that. But he was Roma.
Okay.
So there's an intersection in this. Basically, if you have a certain status and you are white and you were a major figure during the revolution or right after, you basically have a free pass for your whole life. If you're younger, if you are not ethnically Romanian, or maybe if you are an outspoken atheist or something like that, you are very scrutinized. You don't really have gigs. And so on.
I'm curious, and I've heard this from some of my American Romanian friends, is that like Romania even now is extremely religious.
Less so, but yeah, it's I don't know. It was, when I was growing up, it was a very major concern for me. But I was growing up in the north of the country, in a very petit bourgeois town. Yeah, there is this overlap between culture, prestige, and religion in Romania, but it's very regional, and to a teenager it can seem oppressive.
Right.
I don't think actually that big of a part of our life. So most people aren't, should I say, fervently practicing orthodoxy. The vast majority only go to church for Easter.
Right.
Older people, okay, they go to Sunday Mass all the time, but and some of the younger people, but yeah, I don't know, it's not that big of a part of our lives. So, for example, talking about stuff that gets exported from the US, recently, last year, we had this referendum, change our constitution, because our constitution doesn't specify that marriage is between a man and a woman. Constitution says that the marriage is between the husbands, the spouses. There was this coalition founded by American Protestants and by Russians. It was a joint venture. But some of the biggest figures were coming from America. They had this movement to change the constitution. They gathered signatures. Apparently 3 million. There weren't 3 million. They used this number as a propaganda number. Actually, there were 2,700,000, something like that. And they had all the church behind it, of course. They had some of the major parties. It was pretty supportive. So our referendums usually take place for a day. Now the ruling party, PSD, the Social Democratic Party, changed the law so that the referendum could take place during 2 days. So it would meet the quorum, the required number of signatures that the referendum would be valid.
Yeah.
And it didn't meet the quorum. Some people went, but not enough so that it would be thought of as a valid referendum. So religion, I think personally, is a big part of some people's lives, but it's not that big of a political force.
Gotcha.
There is a lot of stuff talked about our cathedral. We are building a cathedral in Bucharest, and about how many money we're spending on it and financing it from the state budget. But the numbers aren't that big compared to other expenses. So I think it's a bit of a new atheist instinct to look at religion and to place blame on religion for a lot of issues in Romania.
Right. I think, and one of the main reasons I ask is because it's always interesting. So I know in the US, religion is extremely weaponized politically. It's used, and I'll give you a quick example, and this is like very prolific within even like the Romanian Christian communities that I've kind of been surrounded by is, and I'll talk specifically about my mother-in-law. She doesn't speak English at all. She only speaks Romanian, and I'll have like political debates with her all the time, just because it's, she loves talking about politics. But I don't know if you know, so like Trump ran on sort of a campaign to get rid of Obamacare. Like that was one of his biggest platforms in his election, was he wanted to get rid of Obamacare and replace, what he said, replace it with something better, but there were never any specifics on what that would be. But my mother-in-law benefited hugely from Obamacare. She ended up getting cancer, and she just recently, they almost ended up going bankrupt because of medical bills. Oh. And I would talk to her, and she's fine now. She's she had her treatments and stuff, and so she's good. But like I'll talk with her, and I'll ask her, why would you support someone who is willing to get rid of like this healthcare plan that's like, sure, it's not great, sure, like universal would have been better, but it's like you benefited from this directly, and you would have been much worse off had this not been here, or had Trump actually been able to get rid of it. But one of the main reasons she always gives me of why she supports Trump is because he's on the side of Christians. And she'll say that, she'll say that he takes, like he's going to keep Christians from getting suppressed by, like the supposedly Islamic forces that are coming in the US, or that's her perspective. And it doesn't even make sense, right? Because when I'll ask her, what is it exactly, like in what way does he support Christians outside of just saying he does, or just pandering to that religious community through like platitudes? What does he actually do for you as a Christian? That's like, it's really, just, she can't really provide anything that's substantial, but then you look at like the actual material things he wants to do, and it's like, it directly harms you. I don't understand that. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. So that's what I see very prevalent in the US in terms of like people who you would maybe label as not being very political, but they do have very strong political views in terms of like, they will strongly support, and this is even true of my mom, she'll strongly support Trump and like not really have substantive reasons why, aside for these like religious reasons. Like for example, abortion is extremely weaponized in US politics, and it's always framed around that religious perspective. And it's the same thing with gay rights. It's the same thing with trans rights. All of that is framed within this sort of attack on Christianity.
Yeah, I don't know. From the outside, it seems that Christianity is a bit of a code word for white supremacy.
I think there's something to that. Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of the concerns, like the abortion issue, it seems to me that it's so from the outside, it seems to me that it's a milder form of the Great Replacement.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to stop aborting children because we have to make more Christian children, and by Christian children we mean white children.
Right.
Again, one of the movement to change the referendum. It was called Coalition for Family, and a lot of their messaging was not really about gay people, but about the Romanian family, the dwindling Romanian family, and it was clear for almost everyone that were they to succeed with this referendum, they would follow another one or other legislative movements to ban abortion.
Yeah,
because that was one of their points, and they focused a lot on immigration, that sort of things. That were you to connect that, it was pretty white supremacist, and I don't think that it's that strong of an issue here. Like, Romanian people are racist, but I don't think they are white supremacists. The US is white supremacy, so you don't have to be racist in the US to participate in white supremacy.
Yeah,
it's built on slavery and so on. I'm not gonna say we don't have that. We had Roma slavery, but I don't think that the social relationships are that strongly formed around that here. So, like, we didn't fight a civil war to preserve slavery.
Yeah.
So one of the second largest party, the Liberal Party, kind of morphed itself to become much closer to the American Republican Party, and it courted a lot of the Pentecostal people from the west of the country. It formed around them. They are giving a lot of the funding, and we will see how they're doing electorally, because at the European elections they did really well. The president called for a referendum for justice, and that helped to bring historical numbers to the polls. So usually European elections don't really bring that many people. Now we had almost as many as we had during the presidential elections, which are the maximum we have. It remains to be seen during the not even the presidential elections, because those will be, again, mostly about our national obsession with justice and corruption, because those are the coordinates around which Romanian politics are concentrated at this point. It remains to be seen during the next local elections and parliamentary elections how well this move will take them.
Let me ask you this, because this is something I was curious about, and you brought up the sort of like focus on corruption within within Romanian politics. What was the Romanian protest that kind of like came up around 2017? Is that a function of that sort of like anti-corruption politics in Romania? Yeah.
That was OG13. So your president has these executive orders.
Yeah.
In Romania, the government issues that. So that's basically what it was. And it concerned itself with modifying the penal code.
Yeah, because I remember just reading a bit about it, and I'm always, I don't know, I feel like I don't know kind of like what sources to trust coming out of Romania, but it seemed like it was like one of the things that was brought up was that they were the largest protests that came out since the 1989 revolution in terms of numbers.
I don't know if that's right. Back in 2011, 2012, we had a big another big wave of protests. We had protests for Roșia Montana, which was a mining site that was kind of, for one thing, was kind of sold for nothing to a really weird Canadian company. It was really strange, so really strange and shady, and they wanted to exploit that area using really bad procedures, using cyanide, and that spurred a big wave of protests. Again, we had some protests for against fracking. Those weren't in Bucharest, so they were more rural, but they were again pretty impressive. And
would you say that those are kind of like the sort of left-wing movements in Romania, or
those and I think the 2012 protests against the privatization of SMURD, of our special emergency unit ambulances, something like that. Those kind of were our left-wing protests. That was sort of our Occupy Wall Street moment, if you want to think it in that way. So it wasn't, there were left-wing people involved with them, but it was a much broader movement. It was much more ecumenical. Eventually, out of that, it spurred a sort of left-wing. Oh, and of course, there was the collective protests. That was actually what started this movement of protests in Romania, this new wave of protests, the collective protest. So a nightclub burned away in Bucharest. A lot of people died. A lot of people died because of infections from the hospital, because they had 4-degree burns, and that's what usually kills you. Again, that was a really weird moment, because again, a lot of people started to protest thinking it would be like the earlier ones, so sort of apolitical, whatever, but they were pretty quickly instrumentalized. They took down the government, which made a faction of our politicians see how they could instrumentalize this movement and these people that go on and protest, and they started to push them more to the right, and not the far right, the liberals. And what I say that it was weird about them was because the owner of the club filled the club against capacity and so on. And still people didn't really protest against private owners of clubs that don't respect the law. They protested against the state, which is understandable. And I mean the conditions in the hospitals, at least some of them were criminal, and were criminal because the funds were misused. They did have a point, but it was very targeted against. And then the protest movement started to become more and more politicized against the major party, against PSD. So it's not really politicized for some parties, because there are basically two parties that are fighting to gain the protesters' support, and they're to win their hearts and minds. But some of them are working, some of them aren't. But for sure, they're protesting against PSD. Which you should protest against PSD, because they call themselves the social democratic party, but they basically represent the Romanian capitalist class. It's interesting hearing the sort of like, I don't know how much of this you would characterize as like the left, but these sort of like political movements in Romania, and then I'm like, I've never heard of these, but I do know the ones that I have heard of. And I think there's a reason why I've only heard of the ones that I have heard of. Like, so to give an example, in the US, among the Romanian community here, there was a couple of years ago a really big deal made about Romanians protesting
what they called the kidnapping of children by Norwegian governments. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
So I think I understand why I heard about that within a Christian Romanian community in the US.
Of course.
And it's funny because I'm obviously like an anarchist. I'm not I'm not going to go around defending states or whatever, but I ended up reading about that specific case because I had family members like literally go to California to protest with other Romanians in California, which is really bizarre. But and it had to do with, I guess in Norway, there are laws against hitting kids. Like you're not allowed to spank kids. And this Christian Romanian family, I guess, was disciplining their kids in that way. And so neighbors reported it and they took their kid or something like that. You probably would know better, so you can correct me if I'm misrepresenting this, but that was my understanding. And it became this whole thing about the way that it was framed was an attack on Christian values. Like the Bible tells us that we should be disciplining our kids this way, and the secular governments that hate God, obviously, like that they're, kidnapping our children because of that,
Yeah, I know why you don't hear about the other, which in my opinion are more important protests. So, for example, Jacobin commissioned an article about some protests last year that ended up with a conflagration between the protesters and the special forces. They are special forces, the Gendarmeria. And instead of commissioning from a left-wing journalist or writer, they commissioned it from a liberal one who framed it in a very, very liberal way. So if Jacobin doesn't report on our issues from a left-wing view, I don't know why anyone else would.
Yeah.
And how would you hear about them?
Yeah.
Other than, I don't know, from even smaller channels that don't have not even Jacobin's reach, which it is not that big of a reach.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the information I'm getting out of Romania is coming from family members who are consuming news outlets that when they tell me about it, they sound super right-wing, even like some of them, honestly, I would probably categorize as fascist. There's one that my mother-in-law would tell me about where they're just talking about a cabal of Jewish people controlling governments and stuff. So it's like pretty out there stuff. And I guess, I don't know, it seems like that's common within Romanian communities to kind of like, at least, and when I say like, I mean in the US, like Romanian communities here, well, they'll sort of gravitate towards conspiratorial sort of like news outlets, extremely right wing, but also, I don't know if it's a function of the fact that they came from Romania with the idea that these are like, that it was an authoritarian state, right? Like that's their view, and that they just have this skepticism of states, right? Like of governments. And so like for them in their mind, they don't look at the influence that capital has over policy. They don't look at the influence of corporations that those have over governments, but they see it as more of this, I think that's where a lot of this, like, you get a lot of that like anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim sentiment, because their view is like that these are these sort of nefarious actors that have in their mind massive power within their own governments. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Like, it just seems very weird to me, the sort of politics that comes out of that.
I think it's a bit of a projection, because as you say, Christians in America exert a very strong influence on the politic.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of project it on the Muslim population. They think that it's the same in or it's how they would wish things would be in the US. So they think the Muslims can affect the politics in the same way they wish they could affect the politics in the US.
Yeah.
And in the same way, ignoring again the much more complicated power structures that are dominated by capital and are masked by religion.
So do you know a lot of Romanians in the US in general, or not really?
Few, but not very many.
Here's my question for you, because like it seems like obviously skewed, like Romanians here are just extremely right-wing for the most part. You kind of brought up like that there may be some that maybe lead liberal, but what's the view on kind of like native Romanians who are in Romania? Like, is it easier for someone to become kind of like more left-leaning in Romania, or did they also skew kind of right?
No, we skew right as well. It's pretty hard. It's very hard because of communism. So for the same reasons that Romanians abroad don't have it easy to become a leftist. So and I think especially for people of not really of my generation, of a bit older than me. So people that 10 years, 20 years older than me, that grew up during the 80s and remember the 80s, which was a time of great austerity. Mm-hmm. And they didn't really had any benchmark for it, so they couldn't really compare it to the more prosperous and a bit more liberal 70s. Like my father has that benchmark for it, and he knows that communism wasn't always, so it doesn't mean, so I mean the real communism as it existed in reality by states that called themselves communism, not the ideal communism.
Yeah.
So you understand. So my father has that benchmark and knows that there was a period when it was better, and there were, and can contextualize the austerity in the 80s and knows why it was as it was. So like bad decisions by the ruling class and by Ceausescu that had their sort of rationale, and worst part by conditions abroad and so on and so forth. But if you were, I don't know, if you were born in the 80s, or you had 10 years or whatever in the 80s, you didn't have that context. You couldn't contextualize that. The 80s were a time of hunger, of repression, of living without heat, without electricity, really repressed media and so on. And it's not really, it's hard to blame them, you know.
Yeah.
But they don't really make an effort to get past their trauma.
Right.
They really like to relive that trauma and to make us live it vicariously. Like a lot of media about communism is about the trauma, either the trauma of the 80s or the trauma of the 50s, the collectivization and experimentul Pitești, which was a lot of it is focused on that, and we collectively we keep bringing it up. We keep bringing it up, and we don't bring it to analyze it, to treat it, to psychologize it, to treat it psychoanalytically somehow, to look at what happened and why it happened, and to move past it as a nation somehow. We just want to relieve that pain and to sit in that pain and just hurt us.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
Yeah, and some people are gaining money and capital from it. That's why it happens.
Well, here's one, and tell me how much you can relate to this, but I'll talk to, family members or other Romanians here. And like, let's say I'll get in a political conversation and I'll specifically avoid using specific words, right? So I won't actually say socialism. I won't say communism. I won't say, those words that are triggering to them. But like, I'll simply just talk about, man, mom, like, wouldn't it be great, if your workplace didn't make you work all these crazy hours, or, gave you more, free time? And like, wouldn't it be awesome if, you had more of a say in your workplace? Or wouldn't that, you know what I mean? And I'll frame it in a way that it's, like, you're just talking about, increasing democracy in the workplace. You're talking about really the primary tenets of anybody who would consider themselves socialist, or a leftist. And I'll get like unanimous agreement. Like I will never have any opposition from that aspect. But then like the moment I'll bring in those words, I'm like, yeah, that's that's actually what a lot of socialists are trying to do is this. And then immediately the response I get is, it's like, no, Seb, like I lived through it. You have no idea. This was my experience, blah, 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 you know? And so that's, I think, the hurdle that I have when talking to these sort of like, you know, Romanians coming from Romania and living in the US, and they've sort of like internalized the sort of propaganda that's revolved around like anti-communism, anti-leftism, and the sort of like neoliberal understanding of politics and an economy, and sort of like who should be making decisions, who has the right to make decisions within an economy. I guess my ultimate question is like, is that prevalent in Romania? Is like, do you run into that sort of situation where just talking about issues themselves, you find a lot of agreement, but the moment you use those like, you know, those key words, like it just like goes the opposite way?
No, I think it's even worse. Like you don't even get agreement with those issues.
Oh wow!
As soon as you start to talk about I don't know, having more control over your work day, it starts to light a bulb in their head, and they'll say that sounds like communism. So I think because we are I don't know, a bit more educated about this by osmosis, by cultural osmosis, not really.
But why would like a Romanian person who's a working person in Romania think that's a bad thing? Just because of the history of communism in Romania? Is that why?
Yeah, and I don't know, it's pretty complicated. On the one hand, we internalized very, very strongly this the neoliberal worldview. So basically the 90s, my impression is that the 90s managed to do what the whole communist period didn't, and it created a new kind of man.
Yeah.
A new kind of person. It created the neoliberal man. We are very competitive and fierce and individualistic and tribal. We might care very much about our family, but very little about anyone else.
Yeah,
we'll have this drive to own property, to own an apartment, to own a car, to own a parking space. We don't really like using public services. We don't really like to use public transport. Yeah, you can't really talk about it. A lot of, even if the job treats you poorly, it's very hard to convince people that you have a right to not be treated poorly at your job. Most people simply accept that if you don't like the place you work at, you should look for another.
Yeah, or start your own business.
Yeah, or something like that. These are more middle class attitudes, because I'm middle class and these are the people I interact with most. Don't really know about the working people, I think, or the people from a working class background. Even they have this the same aspirations as the middle class. I don't think that they really have much more of a class conscience.
Yeah.
And even if they have, I think they are very precaritized and very brutalized by capital. They simply don't have the power and energy to object in some way. They work very much inhumanely amounts of time just to provide for the family and keep on going for a few more days. So I don't think there is a place in their life to question the system.
Right.
And this is what the system wants. Like they want this kind of workers, these disposable workers that they'll drain them of life and energy and everything and just shove them aside.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're just a commodity within the scope of capital. Well, let me ask you this then. Like what was your introduction to like leftism, and how was that journey for you in sort of like in the political environment that exists within Romania?
I don't know. I had a strange political journey. The political identity that first developed in me, I think, was feminism. Mm-hmm. That's what got me, because I was in geek spaces, and I don't know. It seems logical that women should have the same rights as men.
Yeah.
As growing up, there were lots of debates in various media circles, and the anti-feminists were so dumb and so cringe and so nonsensical that naturally I drifted more and more towards feminism, and I familiarized myself with their arguments and their positions and internalized them. And while attending uni, I became a bit of a libertarian.
What kind of? I'm sorry, like libertarian in the European sense or American sense?
In the American sense. So I assistant professor at my faculty that was popular among the students was a very fervent libertarian, and through him I ended up reading sort of blogs and magazines that treated this, and it inoculated in me some ideas, especially about economic thought and economic movements, because I had that mild sock them vision in me. So like I was thinking that Obama was right. I was that kind of socialism that I thought socialism is when the government does things for you, and when the government does things for you, it's nice. Yeah, and you shouldn't think about it anymore. And then I went into the libertarian positions against this, which were
like Milton Friedman.
Yeah. So, stuff like that. I didn't even know about him because they don't really. They're not that smart. But yeah, mostly they kept parroting the arguments, and it kind of made sense. Some stuff it still makes sense in a way. So for a while I was drifting economically to the right, but they at the same time they were becoming really, really fascist, conservative, and anti-feminist, and climate change deniers, and so on. And that was a stop for me, that I couldn't move further, because every time I was reading, I wanted to read about the economy and why the state shouldn't interfere in the economy. They'd
anti-SJW.
Yeah, something about that, and then I bounced back. To, I don't know, sock them position. And I think the thing that radicalized me the most was starting to work. Like during university, I had this I was very guilty that I was not working, that I wasn't providing for myself, that I felt like I was a drain on my parents, on society. I had to prove myself, to prove my worth. I think you can imagine that I was really depressed.
Yeah, I can understand why. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I started working, I realized that worked for nothing. I didn't, even though I was working a lot, I was working more than 8 hours a day, I wasn't producing anything of value for society. And the fact that I was working, I had a lot of people working because of me. So the people cleaning after me, the people providing me with food, the people delivering me stuff that I ordered online, and so on.
Yeah.
Those were all jobs created because I was stuck in a office for 10 hours a day, even more, instead of providing for doing those stuff that I could be doing for myself, and I would enjoy more doing for myself.
Yeah.
So that turned me more techno-utopian something. I was really into UBI for a while. Mm-hmm. I started to go into more leftist Romanian circles because we had presidential elections, and we had to vote with the liberal president against the quote-unquote social democratic president, who Victor Ponta. This is a very strange figure in Romanian politics. He's very chameleonic. Like at that point in 2014, he basically wanted to be the Romanian Erdogan. Now he reinvented himself, and he wants to be the Romanian Tony Blair.
Wow.
Yeah, so we voted with the liberal president against him, and that frustrated a lot of people, and we started to form little online communities. And then I started reading more, and I started reading theory, and I became more and more I don't know, radicalized, and I don't really know what I am. I don't think it really matters because I'm not part of any party. I'm not part of a union. I don't really have much opportunity. So yeah, it would be just a idealized. I hate the online debates about your inclinations. I think it's a very liberal symptom.
No, I agree with you.
I was on a forum, on a Discord for a lefty YouTube channel, and some guy asked me what was my
tendency.
Yeah, right. What's my tendency? And I said, I don't know. Probably, if I'm realistic, I'm sort of a sock dam. And he said me that sock dams get the bullet too. Yeah, I don't really like these kinds of discussions because I don't think they're
just not productive. They're
not really productive. I mean, it doesn't really matter what I think in my head, what I believe in my heart. It matters to some extent, but especially at this point, it matters to do something.
Yeah.
And as long as I'm not doing anything, what does it matter?
I agree. Yeah. I almost feel like a lot of the sort of tendency debates or like discussions in leftist circles is more aesthetic than anything else. Like And I mean, I agree with you there. Like I honestly, I think that's one of the reasons I like these more broad, open tent organizations where, like the tendency, like it's almost, we need to realize how it's more important that we're a unified left movement, just because the left feels so weak in a lot of areas politically, that like to further subdivide ourselves because someone's a sock dem or somebody's Marxist or whatever label they prefer. Like, it's just if it's like preventing us from working together, then it's pointless. Because any political project you look on the left requires a mass movement, and I don't know. It just seems to me like to find a way to make it harder for a mass movement to organize around a specific goal, that's, you're not working towards that goal anymore. You're just pursuing something that's just like, it's purely aesthetic. It's purely some like subculture thing.
A lot of it has this feeling of discussing music genres.
Yeah.
And a lot of the inherited knowledge about it it's pretty ahistoric. Like this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine of people conflating social democrats with wanting a welfare state.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this comes a lot from the American side of things, because they think that social democracy as a project, I don't know how really to posit this. So what we usually say about social democrats, about being not wanting to challenge capitalism,
mm-hmm.
like that's true about the current social democrats, because that's basically the last of the gains that remain from the movements of the post-war, of the interwar period and the post-war period.
Yeah.
And they want to defend that, while the other parties, and that's the thing, the other parties don't really want to dismantle those gains neither. They mostly want to dismantle them for certain people.
Yeah.
You either have the more conservative in the European sense parties that kind of want to privatize everything, but you also have the far right people who want to keep the welfare state, but just for white people. You can find this with Le Pen in France, for example.
Yeah.
And even in the US, in UK, Boris Johnson, for example, I think mentions a lot saving the NHS. I think even with Brexit, a large part of their campaign was about saving the money that the UK presumably gives to the European Union, and saving it and giving it back in the NHS.
Right.
So rhetorically, at least, even the right-wing parties in Europe treasure the welfare state. So this is a conflation that it's a bit unhistorical, and the historical social democratic parties were what you'd call democratic socialists. And this distinction between social democrats and democratic socialists is a more recent one.
No, I can definitely see that. I always saw the distinction as wasn't it Rosa Luxemburg? She her whole thing on revolution or reform, right?
Yeah, but she was a member of the SDP.
Yeah.
She wasn't a member of the Communist Party. She was a member of the Social Democrats.
Yeah.
She was a member of the radical wing of the Social Democrats, but she wasn't part of the Communists. So
the idea, from my understanding, though, was that it's like you have a shared goal, right? Like, so the end goal is the same, but it's how you get there. That's
that's the distinction, and which are the democratic socialists. The democratic socialists are more reformists.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you look at, so like Bernie Sanders here, if you just look at in terms of policy, he would be considered what would be like a New Deal's Democrat. Even from that perspective, like you wouldn't know that if you follow like U.S. politics or like right wing commentary. But it's essentially just like a return to an older form of like reformism, and an older form of like what FDR would have been. It's still maintaining the sort of like capitalist infrastructure, but like just being a little more benevolent to workers, or to give them some more benefits from a thriving economy. You know what I mean?
And presumably with a bit more racial justice.
Yeah, exactly.
His recently released justice program was focused on that.
Yeah, and so whenever I hear leftist circles critiquing Bernie that he's not a true socialist, like that just gets me upset. It's so pointless. That's
there was a comment on a leftist subreddit that I think on LeftTube. I don't know, that Bernie is okay, but we should all agree that if someone more radical comes along, we should vote for them. I don't know, that's a very liberal mindset posturing as a very radical mindset. Because if you are radical, you understand that there is only so much that you can do within the institutions of power.
Yeah.
And it's very strange. And we have those kinds of squabbles in Romania, and it's farcical. It's absolutely farcical. We barely have any kind of left to. We are the parody of leftists. Like it's that, I don't know if it's a saying or something, but if you have two leftists, they'll form three parties.
Yeah,
that's basically what happens here.
So are you hopeful at all with like a left in Romania? Are you hopeful for any sort of movement that's No.
I think we up to a few years ago, I was hopeful that the right could win. So like the right parties that are also rhetorically right. They don't make populist gestures, while actually supporting the Romanian capital. So the right could win. They could go with their program. They could go with their rhetoric. Hopefully their administration would be sufficiently competent that people wouldn't have it that much worse, where the conditions wouldn't worsen. And against them, a fledgling left party or movement could grow, and would have room to grow, and would have room to be in opposition to them. Because now it's very hard for a left movement to be in opposition, because the power is the Social Democratic Party, and they are making gestures towards social democratic and lefty issues, but they are incoherent, and they are poisoning the well. So one of the protests was concerned with the conditions of people in prisons, which is a very fair issue, and it's something that we should tackle, because we had court cases at the Human Rights Organization. So prisoners won court cases against the Romanian state because of the conditions that are kept in. So this is a very important issue, a left issue, because we were against the carceral state. But they did it in the most egregious way, not so much for the care of the people, but to take out their own people from prison.
Yeah.
That were there for cases of corruption and so on. So they are poisoning the well. They are taking these issues and making it, treating them with so transparently bad faith that you cannot push for them in public discourse.
Yeah.
So yeah, my hope until a few years ago was that after the right wins, truly left-wing movement can develop and gain little by little popular support. But I don't really think they are that much interested into that, and I've been disenchanted with the human character of the people from that movement. And as I said, they are the kinds of people that would uncritically share videos from right-wing media and claiming that the Western left lost its mind.
I see. Yeah.
So I don't really I don't see how it can happen other than I don't know, a very organic populist left starting from the workers. I don't know how much that's possible.
Do you does Romania have any sort of like strong labor movements in terms of unionization or anything like that?
Sort of, but not really. So the labor law was changed 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, in various ways. It's very hard to form a new union, which makes it much harder for the unions to negotiate. And little by little, since the 90s, the unions become very politicized, became very... They lost their purpose. They become just that parody of the union as a front for the mafia.
Right.
There are some hopes. I think there were some protest movements that were supported by the major union confederations. There is a tech workers union that's growing, and it's fronted by young people and politically active people with a strong left vision. I don't know how much of that transpires to the workers, but since they I don't know if they'll see the benefits they get from participating in that union, maybe they'll become more radicalized themselves. But I don't know. It's a bad political moment for us here.
Yeah.
And for us in Europe in general, mostly because of the really bad way the European institutions, the European Union and the European Bank handled the crisis. And we still fight against it, and there's a recession coming. Hopefully won't be as bad as the 2007-2008 one, but we in Europe haven't fully recovered from the last one. So it will be a moment of crisis, but I don't think the left is strong enough to capitalize on that crisis.
Yeah, no, I agree with you there. I think that's true even in the US too, where we're kind of, I think a lot of people on the left are aware of the imminent crisis, the imminent recession that's coming, but we haven't built up the popular movements that, that need to be there to capitalize on it. We just don't have it. One other question I had, just kind of like on the flip side. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I hope you do. I hope you do, because this is basically my only hope that you in the US and the UK will capitalize on this moment and will have a strong electoral victory, because so the nascent Liberal Party isn't made up of very strongly politicized people and ideological inclined people. They are very much into a technocratic mindset. Like a lot of the members of that party came from a so-called technocratic government, a government put in place after the collective fire.
Yeah.
So it was sort of built up as a political party as it presented itself in the parliamentary elections, it had some prominent left-wing people in it. It brought some prominent left-wing people in the parliament, for example. So it was a sort of ecumenical, non-ideological party, which its function was to bring new people into politics, to make room for new people into politics. And even now, as it asserted officially a more right-wing identity, there are people in the party challenging that.
Yeah.
And wanting at the very least a return to that neutral, technocratic vision of itself. So a lot of the members, a lot of the people that are doing the rank and file work aren't very ideological, and I think that with a victory by a left-wing political movement abroad, they will copy it, because we are very self-colonized and we copy very much what happens in the West. As I've said, the rhetoric you use in your democratic debates is basically what becomes policy proposals.
That's depressing.
Yeah, but hopefully if you start using better rhetoric, we'll start using that better rhetoric, and that will fuel us. And if they shift at least a bit slightly to more sane, not even left positions, but I don't know, more sane liberal positions. Like if they shift from the Joe Biden vision of politics to, I don't know, Kamala Harris vision of politics, that would still be an improvement.
No, I mean, yeah, no, I agree with you there. I think, look, I in terms of like U.S. politics and what the left's project is here, it's gonna be really just. My hope is that the 4 years of Trump has been enough to wake people up. I know it's kind of woken me up a bit politically, in terms of like activism. I think that's been the case for a lot of people on the left here, and my hope, and I do see a lot of activism revolved around, you know, a lot of popular support around Bernie Sanders, which is super encouraging. And it's kind of the way that I view it. It's like it's the Democratic establishment's goal to either sabotage that or to insert themselves and insert their establishment agenda within that sort of rubric, right? Like in a lot of ways, how right-wing movements will appropriate the language of the left. My fear is that the establishment Democratic elements would, kind of screw over Bernie again, like they did in 2016. But the popularity is there, right? Like Bernie has the popular support, though his policies have a lot of popular support. So I think it's just mobilizing around those things and getting that voter base activated. And I think that's kind of going to be sort of like the pendulum swing in the other direction in terms of like getting some victories for the left after having to go through what, Trump's been trying to do for the past since 2016. So
we're counting on you.
Yeah. I mean, does this kind of remind you of, like Russia waiting for the revolution in Germany a little bit?
Sort of, but not quite. I mean, Russia was still a major power. We're just don't have the power to move beyond. I don't know. I think in a way, it's strange that Romania didn't become even more far right, because some surrounding countries veered to the right a lot more, like Poland and Hungary.
Yeah.
Even worse than we are. They are borderline fascistic.
Are you worried at all about the rise of fascism?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I don't know that so much in Romania. It's very tricky because the mainstream political movements already embody a lot of the fascistic movements. So they use some fascistic rhetoric, they use some fascistic tactics, but not to the same extent that a fascist party would do. So they serve as a sort of they kind of absorb the popular energy that could go in a full-on fascistic movement.
Yeah.
So there's that. It's not good, not terrible. don't know how much potential there is for it. Like we as I've said, we had that referendum that was very, very strongly informed by white supremacist ideas, by very fascistic ideas, and by fascistic people. And they didn't capture the popular support. So on the other side, we have paramilitary training camps for fascists. So
I've actually seen videos of, I don't think it was in Romania, but yeah, like in Europe, where they'll be training in the woods, little fascist cell groups.
Yeah, we have those. So
protecting the border.
It's scary. I know that I'm a man and I'm white, so. On the other hand, leftists historically were the fascists' first targets. So
yeah,
and through sheer empathy, like even if they don't kill me, I don't want to live in a fascist state. I don't want to.
Yeah, it's worth fighting against for sure.
Of course.
I think one thing that this conversation has opened my eyes up a little bit was sort of like how high the stakes are. You know what I mean? Like on the American side, something that I don't know. Maybe it's. I think a lot of Americans are ignorant, even like on the left, of kind of like how our politics influence everything else in bad ways a lot of the time. So yeah, the stakes feel very high. I don't know.
Yeah, it's very important, and I think a more internationalist mindset in the Western left, especially the American left, would benefit us all.
Yeah,
I think even you. For example, I don't really know in the US, but for example, in the UK, there are lots of students who mobilize themselves against Brexit, and the Labour Party, because it was for so long pretty wishy-washy on the Brexit issue, lost their support. And it wasn't only about Romanian students, it was also basically many students from all over Europe. And it was a pretty large contingent of people who could canvass and campaign and give their resources for them. They really didn't, they wanted to channel that energy, didn't really have a political movement where to channel it, or if they had, they did it into the Greens and the Liberals. And the Greens in the parliamentary elections had a pretty large score. I don't know if it was historical, but it was the largest score the Greens had in recent years.
Yeah.
So yeah, one example. And for I don't know, ideological and ethical reasons, like I think that the left that is not internationalist isn't really a left.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think maybe that's even a big takeaway from the left movements post World War is a lack of international worker solidarity. I mean, I think that's one aspect I learned a lot from reading about U.S. labor history and contrasting that with European labor history. Is a lot of the victories that happened within the U.S. labor movements were very trade specific rather than a sort of like broader victory for workers, even in our own country, which led to a lot of the ability of capital to literally export jobs and losing all those victories that those unions had won because they were so, I guess, limited in scope and what they were trying to achieve. They were only worried about their own benefits rather than a broader working class.
Right, that makes sense. One final thing that I wanted to ask you, on your Twitter bio it also says that you're a member of the IWW.
Yes.
What does that mean for you?
Well, so the IWW, and there's a lot of members in the IWW who are also members of DSA, but IWW, one reason I like them is that they're very much more focused on unionizing workplaces. So they're leading the way on Burgerville unions and Little Big Burger. Their union is IWW, and I love the idea of worker-controlled unions, right? Because there's all different types of unions. Not all unions are there's a range of good unions and bad unions, but I think the best ones are ones that are controlled and managed by the workers themselves. So I think that's why the IWW was really appealing to me. And the IWW has a really, really cool history historically. I mean, they're pretty weak relative to where they were in the past in U.S. politics. But like, yeah, they have a really badass history, which
cool. Yeah, I think that's it. It was a very long discussion, a very enlightening one. Thank you very much for coming on. So is there anything else you'd like to tell us or to share with us?
I don't know, just don't give up.